Now, let me spin you a yarn about a gal named Sarah. A plain little soul who lived a life so ordinary you'd swear it was stitched together by a committee of drowsy bureaucrats. She wasn't much to look at, neither homely nor handsome, just the sort of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting her. She dwelt in a sleepy town called Plattsville, where the days dragged on like a mule with a sore hoof. And the most exciting event was when Old Man Jenkins's cow got loose and chewed up Widow Tate's petunias. Sarah worked down at the dry goods store, stacking bolts of calico and measuring out yards of muslin for folks who hadn't a lick of imagination in their bones. Her life was a treadmill, and she was the donkey plodding along, round and round, with nothing but the same dusty horizon to stare at. But there was a train that rolled through Plattsville every afternoon, a rattling, huffing beast of iron and steam that came shrieking out of the west like it had someplace important to be. Folks in town didn't pay it much mind. Most of them never set foot on it, content to let it whistle past, while they sat on their porches, swatting flies and sipping lemonade. To Sarah, though, that train was a notion, a whisper of something, bigger than the hemmed-in world she knew. It gleamed in the sun like a promise, its cars painted up in reds and golds, and when it pulled into the station, it seemed to say, "Climb aboard, girl, and see what's what." Opportunity, that's what it was. Opportunity with a capital O. The kind that don't knock twice if you're too timid to answer the door. Now, on this particular day, the kind of day where the air's so still, you can hear a pin drop a mile. Off? Sarah stood on that platform, her bonnet shading her eyes, her worn-out valise clutched in her hands. She'd been toying with the idea of leaving for weeks, ever since she'd found a crumpled flyer under the counter, advertising a millinery job in St. Louis. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall of her humdrum existence, and through it she glimpsed a flicker of something bright. Still, she hesitated, as folks often do when the devil they know starts arm wrestling with the devil they don't. Her feet shuffled on the warped boards, her heart thumping like a drum at a county. Fair, and she muttered to herself, "Sarah, you ninny, what's it to be? Stay here and rot like last year's apples, or take a chance on that iron horse?" The train let out a bellow, steam hissing from its flanks, and the conductor hollered, "All aboard!" The moment hung there, heavy as a thundercloud, and Sarah's eyes darted from the platform to the open door of the car. It was now or never, and she knew it. Knew it the way a river knows it's got to keep flowing or turn to mud. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and made her choice. But what that choice was, and where it led her, well, that's a tale for another stretch of this here story. A Life Unlived. Now, suppose Sarah's nerve had failed her that day, as it's wont to do with folks who've spent too long staring at the same four walls. Picture her standing there on the platform, valise in hand, bonnet trembling in the breeze, while that train hooted and puffed its way out of sight. She'd have watched it go, the red and gold cars shrinking into a speck on the horizon, till the only sound left was the creak of the station sign swinging in the wind. "Well, Sarah," she'd have said to herself, "you've gone and done it, or rather, you ain't done it, and that's the rub." And with that, she'd have turned on her heel and trudged back to Plattsville, her dreams trailing behind her like a dog that's been kicked one too many times. Back she'd go to the dry goods store, where the bolts of calico sat waiting like old friends who don't much care if you're late. She'd take up her scissors and her measuring tape, and the days would roll on, each one a carbon copy of the last. The sun would rise over the same sagging rooftops, the rooster would crow the same rusty tune, and Sarah'd sweep the same dust off the porch every morning till you'd swear she was polishing the earth itself. She'd wait on the same customers, Mrs. Pritchard with her pinched face and her endless fussing over gingham, and young Tommy Hale, who'd swipe a peppermint stick when he thought she wasn't looking. Life would stretch out before her, flat as a pancake and twice as dry, with nothing to mark the years, but a few more wrinkles and a crick in her back. Oh, she'd dream though. Don't think she wouldn't. At night, when the crickets sang their lonesome song, she'd sit by her window and wonder what might have been. she'd see that train in her mind's eye, chugging off to St. Louis or maybe farther, to places with names she couldn't pronounce and folks who wore silk instead of homespun. She'd imagine herself stepping off into a bustling station, her valise traded for a smart little hat box, her hands busy with ribbons instead of dusty cloth. But then the rooster'd crow, and the dream'd scatter like smoke, leaving her with nothing but a pang in her chest and a sigh that could have blown out a candle across the room. Regret, that's the burr that'd stick to her soul. It'd creep. In slow, the way damp seeps into a cellar, till every glance at the railroad tracks felt like a jab from a sharp stick. She'd hear folks talk of the world beyond Plattsville, tales of steamboats and skyscrapers, and she'd smile a thin little smile, nodding like she understood, when all the while she was tallying up the chances she'd let slip through her fingers. She'd grow old there, Sarah would, her hair turning gray as the platform boards, her life a quiet little tragedy nobody'd bother to write down. And when she'd finally shuffle off this mortal coil, the town bury her under a stone that said, "Here lies Sarah." She stayed, and that'd be the end of it. A life transformed now. Let's suppose Sarah had a spark of gumption that day and flung herself aboard that train just as the whistle blew its last hurrah. Picture her clutching that valise, her bonnet askew, stumbling into a car full of strangers who eyed her like she'd wandered into the wrong parlor. The wheels clacked, the steam hissed, and off she went, Plattsville fading into a smudge of dust behind her. She'd have sat there, heart pounding like a blacksmith's hammer, half expecting the conductor to toss her off at the next stop for daring to think she belonged on such a contraption. But he didn't, and the train rolled on, carrying her, toward a life she couldn't have dreamed up if she'd tried. First stop was St. Louis, where that millinery job from the flyer turned out to be real. Glory be. And Sarah found herself elbow deep in feathers and felt stitching hats for ladies who wouldn't have given her the time of day back home. The city was a circus, all noise and glitter, with streetcars clanging and hawkers shouting and folks rushing about like ants on a spilled picnic. She'd rent a little room above a bakery, waking each morning to the smell of fresh bread instead of Plattsville's stale air. And she'd step out into a world that moved faster than a greased pig. At a fair, she'd meet people too, odd ducks and bright sparks alike. There was Clara, a seamstress with a laugh like a foghorn, who taught her to sew a brim so fine it'd make a peacock jealous, and Mr. Tate, a dapper gent with a mustache you could hang a hat on, who'd tip her a wink and a nickel for every hat he bought. But it wasn't all roses and ribbons. The work was hard, the hours long, and Sarah's fingers bled more than once from a slipped needle. She'd miss the quiet of Plattsville sometimes, the way you miss a tooth after it's pulled. Painful when it was there, but lonesome once it's gone. She'd stumble too. One day she'd botch a hat for a banker's wife, and nearly lose her job, and another time she'd trust a slick-talking peddler who sold her a bolt of cloth that unraveled like a politician's promises. Yet for every tumble, there'd be a triumph. A hat in a shop window with her name on it, or a chance meeting with a traveling troupe that'd sweep her off to a theater, where she'd gape at actors strutting under lights brighter than the sun. Her life would twist and turn like a river finding its course. She'd learn to laugh louder, cry harder, and stand taller than she ever had in Plattsville. She'd take risks, buying a little shop of her own one day, or kissing a fellow under a gas lamp after a dance. And some'd pay off, while others'd leave her broke or broken-hearted. But through it all, she'd grow into a Sarah nobodied, recognized back home. A woman with calluses on her hands and fire in her eyes, shaped by the unexpected, the glorious, and the downright messy. That train didn't just carry her away. It remade her, piece by piece, into something new. The power of choice now. Let's pull back the curtain on this little drama of Sarah's and chew over what it all means. For there's a lesson here big enough to choke a mule if you ain't paying attention. Life, you see, is a game of choices. And everyone's a fork in the road with a signpost that's half blurred and wholly untrustworthy. Sarah stood on that Plattsville platform, with two paths afore her. One, a sleepy trail she'd trod till her shoes wore thin, and the other, a wild ride on a train that might have dumped her in a ditch or delivered her to glory. She could have stayed put, safe as a hen in a coop, and ended up with nothing but regrets to warm her old age. Or she could have jumped aboard and let fate deal the cards, for better or worse. That's the power of choice, friends, and it's a mighty thing, sharper than a razor, and trickier than a fox in a henhouse. Take a gander at your own life, and you'll see the same crossroads popping up like dandelions in spring. Maybe it's a job you're too scared to quit, or a town you're too cozy to leave, or a gal you're too shy to court. Every day's a chance to stay or go, to speak or hush, to grab the reins or let 'em lie. Sarah's train wasn't just a heap of iron and steam. It was a symbol, plain as day, of what happens when you quit hugging the shore and paddle out into the current. Stay on the platform, and you'll know exactly what tomorrow brings. The same porridge, the same faces, the same slow grind till you're dust. But step aboard, and you're tossing dice with the universe. Could be you'll land in a palace. Could be you'll end up with a busted valise and a tale to tell. But at least it's your tale. Don't get me wrong now. Choice ain't a golden ticket to paradise. Sarah'd tell you that, with her pricked fingers and her empty pockets some days. Stepping out of the comfort zone, as the highfalutin folks call it, is like jumping off a barn roof. You might soar, or you might sprain something, and there's no telling till you're airborne. But here's the kicker. Even the sprains teach you something, and the soaring, well, that's worth the risk. Back in Plattsville, Sarah'd have lived a life so predictable you could set a clock by it. But on that train, she found a world that kicked and hollered and made her kick back. That's what choice does. It hands you the wheel, whether you're steering towards sunshine or a storm. So, I reckon the trick is to eyeball those opportunities when they come snorting by and not be too quick to wave them off. They don't always look like much. Might be a rusty old train or a crumpled flyer under a counter, but they're the hinges on which life swings. Sarah chose, and it made her a new woman, for good or ill. What about you? What's your train? And are you climbing aboard or watching it roll away? Final thoughts. Well, folks, we've trailed Sarah from the dusty planks of Plattsville to the bustling streets of St. Louis, and back again in our minds. And it's time to set down the yarn and light a pipe over what it all amounts to. Her tales. A mirror, you see, held up to our own fidgety souls, and it's asking us plain as a preacher on Sunday. What's the worth of a life that don't dare to budge? Sarah had her train, her moment to leap or linger, and whether she stayed put with, regrets gnawing at her like termites, or rode off into a whirl of chance, it all boiled down to one truth. Nothing moves till you do. Life ain't a still pond waiting for you to admire your reflection. It's a river, swift and muddy, and you've got to wade in, or watch it rush by. There's a heap of value in taking a risk, even if it leaves you with skinned knees and a lighter pocket. Staying safe's all well and good, keeps the roof over your head and the soup on the table. But it's the gambles that put the salt in the stew. Sarah could have rotted in Plattsville, counting the cracks in the ceiling till kingdom come, and nobody'd have blamed her. It's what most folks do after all, hugging the shore like a barnacle on a boat. But if she'd climbed aboard that train, and I reckon she did, for the sake of a good story, she'd have tasted the sweet and the sour of a world bigger than her backyard. That's the prize of change. It don't promise you a soft bed, but it hands you a map with no edges, and the drawing of it's up to you. So here's the wind-up, and I ain't mincing words. Quit your dawdling and make a choice, any choice, before the clock runs out and the train's long gone. It don't have to be a grand exodus. Maybe it's telling that boss you're worth more than he pays, or packing a bag for a town you've only seen on a postcard, or just planting a flower where there's nothing but weeds. The point is to stir the pot, to kick up some dust, to live a life that's yours and not some hand-me-down from folks too timid to dream. Sarah's story ends with hope. Whether she's stitching hats or staring at the stars because she did something, and that's a spark worth fanning. I'll leave you with this, and you can chew it over at your leisure. What's your train? And when's it pulling in? Don't just sit there nodding like a congregation at a dull sermon. Talk it out. Tell me or tell a friend, or shout it to the wind. Share what you'd do if you had Sarah's chance, or what you've already done. When the whistle blew, life's a choice, and it's high time we all acted like it. Now go on, make a ruckus, and let's hear about it.